So welcome to the What If Wednesday series. And as you guys know, these are free public lectures that the University of Canterbury has been holding pretty much shortly after the earthquakes, and it's something that I think it's a really good chance for the university to showcase not only some of the works of its academics, but also some of the thinkings, if you like, of some of the business staff that we have and various other fields that we have on campus. And I suppose I fit into both of those camps, and I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. Just a reminder that if you do come along, you know, they're obviously free, but just to make sure you register, so it's important that we have a detail of who has been, and for future events. Now, just a bit of housekeeping. The toilets are just out the door to the left. In the case of a fire, follow me. I'll certainly get you out. And in case of an earthquake, just stay where you are until obviously it stops. These buildings have been well and truly tested on a number of occasions, and are more than capable of dealing with what nature could throw at us. And then we'd assemble out on the main car park, hopefully not too much longer in this rain. I suppose by way of introduction, my name is Tony Mortensen. I'm the Director of International Growth Strategies at the University of Canterbury. And it really is my pleasure to be here this evening to talk about something that I'm quite passionate about, not only from a research perspective, but certainly in terms of an application perspective. My background is both from the university side, the academic side, but I did actually start out in practice-based environment. I did accounting as an undergraduate student, accounting and finance, did postgraduate in honours and taxation, and then did a master's of accounting and finance. And then went out and practiced as an accountant for one of the big four accounting firms, KPMG. And it was really my first taste of a larger organisation and how it operates, how they're structured. And it is even interesting to look at the likes of a KPMG versus, say, some of the other big four, and seeing the way that they actually set up their organisations and how they structure them. And even though they're all competing in the same space, they're actually operating quite differently. And I want to talk a little bit about that later on. Then moved out into more of a financial controlling role in a private company. And once again, that was operating in a very flat structure-based environment, where the shareholders were also actively involved in the business, and a lot of the decision-making was made not necessarily on the hop, but certainly very focused on what the market was needing at that point in time. And that's quite an interesting perspective that we'll come back to a bit later on. The sort of graduation there was working for a very large multinational organisation, American-owned, still privately owned, but still a multinational, so it was driven by quite a different change in their structure, and certainly the organisational structure in terms of how they managed the different branches was quite unique. And then, of course, coming into the university, and the university environment was yet again a change in the way that we manage, and it's certainly a change in terms of how the organisation sees itself. And I suppose this starts to get back to the topic which I'm looking at, specifically around the concept of centralisation, and whether you have a centralised or decentralised structure, whether it has an impact on the innovative capacity of an organisation. And I think one thing I'd like to touch on very shortly is, you know, why is that important in terms of innovative perspective, certainly for us as a country and as a nation moving forward. My previous role, before I took on the role of the Director of Growth Strategies, was Director of Executive Development Programs. So for me, it's a funny situation, because when I agreed to do this lecture, I was running a department that had revenue stream and expenditure, and I was what would be called a contributor to the contribution margin. I was generating funds that went back to the central services, and now I work for the central services, so I'm a consumer of those central funds, and I have no revenue streams other than what I generate for the rest of the university. So as an accountant, I struggle a little bit with any business model where I can't see a revenue at the top and expenses in the middle, and hopefully a positive figure at the bottom. So it's been quite a different change in approach for me, and hopefully you'll see some of that coming through in terms of the understanding. I suppose the key question here is, why is it important? And I think for me, it's a word, it's called productivity. We need to understand productivity as organisations and as a country. And I think innovation itself is such a fundamental component of a productive organisation or a productive country. The idea of innovation, when we sort of think of organisations that are very innovative, those Googles and Apples and M3s and Toyotas, they tend to come with them an idealism that they do things so much differently than everyone else. And that's how they're able to produce this constant stream of highly innovative products. But innovation itself is not just about products, it's about the way we do things. Organisations that are service focused can have high levels of innovation, and yet what they produce is a service base that is consumed by the environment that they're selling to. And so it's not necessarily just about products that are created in a lab environment and something goes bang and poof and then all of a sudden we have something new. It's about looking at organisational behaviour and thinking about how we can improve that and how we can do it through innovation. And that's really why this topic's important from my perspective. I probably will just say before I go on that if you're after a definitive answer to that question, is centralisation killing innovation? The answer is definitely you won't get that. All I'm really trying to do is to raise a number of debatable issues that we can actually think about as managers moving forward. And I think that's probably going to be the most important thing, is that we try to get our managers, whether they're at the senior level or the development level, to think seriously about any decision that decentralises or centralises an organisation and factor in not simply one or two parts of that equation. And I think we've seen good examples of they've narrowed in on one component and as a result have decided to centralise or decentralise. And that's when we get into the danger zone. And so what I want to do is just raise a lot of those issues, and you guys can think about that in a more of a application-based environment. I used this slide actually at my last presentation I did when I was talking about leadership versus management, because it's such an effective way to think about productivity. I mean, New Zealand, whether we like it or not, is lagging behind the global market. And yes, we're in good space. We've got a 3-horse race on at the moment. We've got the Canterbury rebuild, which is a 3-legged horse, I think, at this stage, but hopefully we'll start running eventually. We have quite a high level of net immigration going into the Auckland market, and certainly the top end of the North Island is feeling that growth. And we still have quite a strong primary produce environment, irrespective of the commodity prices. But you take those 3 factors out of our economy and it's actually relatively sluggish. We have got some real key indicators. We've got relatively low unemployment compared to other parts of the world. We have a reasonably strong GDP, even though it's relatively small, but it is consistent. But when we look at our GDP compared to our share of, if you like, the OECD countries, even per capita, we are lagging behind. And that is a concern. It is a real concern. I think this is the graph that really sort of drives it home for me. And I was going to update it, and then when I saw the information that was coming through on the latest quarters out of 2014, there really wasn't a lot of point. There hasn't been a lot of change. We are not developing as a country. We are working longer at producing less. So if anything, we're working harder at being less efficient. Now, I don't know whether that's a good thing. I certainly think from our perspective of how we work, it's probably an important part of that discussion, but to isolate why we are continuing down this track of longer hours of work and less productivity per capita is something that we actually need to start taking a serious look at. And if I think about the great words of Sir Paul Callaghan, he was very pointed in the idea that everything to do with productivity growth relates to innovation. Innovation is everything, was the statement he would make. Without innovation, we don't create increased productivity. And so therefore, we need to find out and we need to understand what drives innovation in our organisations, because otherwise we will not create that environment of productivity, and therefore as a country we will become and continue to become less productive for every hour worked. I don't know about you, but I work hard enough, and I'd like to think that every hour I contribute to my work environment is actually being as productive as it can be. But if it's being hampered through either the environment that I'm working in or the systems or the structures that I'm having to operate within, that frustrates me, especially when I see a potential for increased capacity. It's not being seen. We are also lagging behind. I mean, we have got some good runs on the board. I mean, 17th out of 142 countries. That's a really quite an impressive statistic, looking at the Global Innovation Index. But a lot of our innovation is actually coming out of the garage shed. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's fantastic innovation. The rocket labs of this world, even the Martin jetpacks, they're starting in pretty much someone's backyard. And this really comes back to the type of business environment that we operate. And I'll talk a bit about the size of our business economy and the reliance we have on what's called the SMEs, the small and medium-sized companies. But we have lots of really amazing innovation, but they don't end up driving massive companies with huge volumes of employees, which really start to kickstart an economy. Xero is probably one of those products, if you like, that has been developed in the New Zealand market that is starting to gain significant global traction and is actually starting to generate quite a large staff base behind it. But even companies like Raycom that are effectively a really cutting-edge R&D company producing world-renowned products, their staff base is still relatively light, and in fact now they've moved most of that offshore to China. So you can sort of see where this problem's coming from, but it is something we need to address. Once again, Paul Callaghan talked about the idea that we just need more high-tech companies. We need more high-value, high-margin, and certainly more revenue per employee organisations out there, and we need to do that through becoming more innovative in what we do and how we do it. So what I want to do now is just touch on a couple of ideas, and obviously this is about centralisation, decentralisation as a concept. And I can't help myself as an ex-lecturer. I've got to go through those definitions and make sure that we clearly understand the topic that we're talking about and understand the environment which we're going to discuss it. So I'm sure I don't have to sit here and tell you what the word central means, but in the concept of where we're addressing it, it's really focused on where the head of decision making takes place. Now, I will talk a little bit about this because centralisation by definition is dealing with the where the decision making takes place, where the planning and the controlling and all those critical components that we know drive organisations forward. But what we are seeing is a greater increase in centralisation, not necessarily from a core decision making practice, but through core services. And so we're finding some of those core services that are critical to organisational development are being centralised, not necessarily the key decision making. And that could be just as bad, if not worse, when we think about its potential impact on an organisation as a whole. But we talk about this idea of keeping all the decision making powers within that head or centre. And of course, most of them are going to be located in some sort of main department at a management or with where the management take place. So it's interesting to even see that centralisation image there. It's really not showing an organisational chart, which we expect to see in a normal autocratic environment, but it is still a hub around which all of those key management decisions are being made, as opposed to cluster group based environment. The issue really is about understanding that authoritative positioning and how that influences an organisation overall. Do we leave all of the critical decisions in the hands of few? I think that's the key question we have to ask ourselves. Are we an economy that are happy to have the masses doing the bulk level of the dog work and a very few left with the critical decision-making power that drives the organisation forward? That the danger with that is, what if they get it wrong? And we have seen numerous examples of organisations that have been led by an individual who has got it wrong, and what the catastrophe that can result from that type of approach. Not to mention the humanistic side of having a range of qualified employees who are willing to contribute to that critical decision-making process, who aren't engaged, and therefore are simply used for the purpose of labour as opposed to the purpose of intelligence. And I think that's something, as a small economy, we need to be really, really careful about. I mean, that's going way back to the Dark Ages. It's something we need to think about. We've seen a change, though. There's no doubt about it. Centralisation sort of dates back to, really, you think about the 1700s, where centralisation just wasn't possible. You had organisations that were set up and they literally had to have everything that was needed to generate wealth in the actual city or in the environment that they were actually producing, simply because it was unable, if you like, it was an enabling environment to be able to have levels of communication across those wider groups. I mean, the carrier pigeon was not quick enough for day-to-day transactions to be held at a centralised level. We need to employ someone. Could be a couple of months, but we'll make a decision when it comes back. I don't know whether much has changed, to be honest. We just push send, but it still seems to take us long for some of those critical decisions to come back. And some of those arguments around why centralisation is not necessarily what's best for driving an organisation forward. But we're now seeing it not just within a departmental component at an organisation level. Here's a big organisation, we'll put our senior management, our core services within one place, and then what we'll do is we'll let them dictate, if you like, how we're going to operate the organisation. We're now seeing that transferred to different parts of the country. I've got to wait till Auckland gets back to me. Now we're actually seeing a greater emphasis placed on, it's gone to Australia. Yeah, no, we have to wait for Melbourne to get back to us on that decision. And then, of course, it starts to, we're now in the States, they're on a different time zone. I've sent the email, but I've now got to wait 24 hours for that to come back. But eventually that decision will come back to us and we'll be able to move forward, hopefully. So you can start to see how a centralisation process, even though we've got a shrinking global market, can be still quite problematic. And I don't care what you say, it's very difficult to use a real-time discussion and decision-making process using even technologies like Skype. But there's no doubt about it, the introduction of technology has been a huge shift in the decentralised process. And as we saw certainly coming up through the 80s was really where the concept of decentralisation really started to take hold. And it really came off the back of the US, coming out of the 70s, very depressed market, the oil shock, and companies just started saying, we've just got to do things different. And what is that difference going to be? Decentralise our working environment. Start to create these innovative clusters and let them go out and perform their requirements. Unfortunately, we then started to see a lot of, if you like, move away from core business. And so a lot of organisations started to acquire other companies that were in completely different fields to what they'd normally engaged with. We had insurance companies buying banks, you know, NZI Insurance was a classic example. And of course at the late 80s when the share market clicked in, suddenly all the companies started saying, actually what we need to do is now get back to our core business. And so they clustered out, they created a level of decentralisation, and then they started to re-centralise as financial constraints started to hit. But there's no doubt about it, I would say we're still in a very much a decentralised environment. I wouldn't say we're centralised by virtue of definition, but not as much as I think we should be looking at if we really want to move forward. So think about some of these ideas that have come out through research. And look, it's not surprising. I don't think you guys will be overly concerned or blown away with anything that researchers have identified in this space, but some of the ideas that have been put forward do help us understand the importance of the debate. As I said, that the 1980s really drove the move to a decentralised process, and it was pretty much, if you read any literature in the 80s out of management, certainly you know, some of those key founding authors, they will all be saying the same thing. Decentralisation is the only way forward. We are now into a new era of business and organisational behaviour and structure. And of course that did take hold. There was a couple of other sort of ideas that started to come out, but these had already been pitched back in the early 60s, which is this idea that we can't have a pure model of decentralisation or a pure model of centralisation. We have to have some level of balance. And that the trouble is, every organisation will have a different level of balance. And theoretically, we do have a perfect balance, but practically we don't. And some of the challenge that we actually face as managers is, what is that appropriate balance? We might like to centralise HR because it's important, but then there's no way I want to start centralising R&D, because that's just crazy talk, or the sales team, or the IT component of the business operation. So we started to see a lot of fragmentation in terms of that process. This is where we get to a dynamic balance, and the dynamic balance is really driven from what the market is requiring from the organisation. And I'll definitely come back to this point, because from my perspective, organisations should be driven from the market, i.e. who they serve. Whether it's a public or a not-for-profit or a private organisation, it's all about the purpose of being. And that should drive the organisational structure, not the other way around. The idea of this ultimate control versus almost a pure corporate anarchy started to emerge. Do we really want everyone thinking independently of the organisation so that we can create high levels of engagement, but then on the other side of it we might have various amounts of energy going off in different areas that isn't necessarily going to produce any benefit to the organisation as a whole? And I think that is once again one of those challenges. So there was some obviously another amount of emerging work that came out, and really it was looking at the idea that we just need to make sure as managers, when we're undergoing reviews of corporate structural environments, that we need to start to take a less of a heavy hand to the approach. And I think this is something we can learn from, is that when you see organisations move through quite a heavy centralisation process, although they'll never call it that, it's called a rationalisation process, you will start to see quite broad strokes across the organisation. We are going to centralise all of this area, and it happens within a very short space of time. There is no lead-in to actually make an assessment about whether we are actually heading in the right direction. And that's usually because in a lot of cases it's driven through financial need, not necessarily through the demands of the client or what is best in terms of the organisational overall strategy. It's usually a financial decision. Now don't get me wrong, I'm an accountant, I like financial decisions. I can understand them and you can work them out in advance of whether they're going to make sense. But they can be very short-lived. It is very easy to work out if something is going to have a net benefit to the organisation in a short period of time. What you can't work out is the impact it's going to have over a longitudinal period. So we talk about these strengthening the decision rights. So this is all about handing down decision-making ability down to those within the organisation, allowing subordinates to actually start to engage in critical decision-making activity and seeing how that results and plays out. Streamlining processes, gain efficiencies, accelerating skill development. I mean, the more flatter the structure, the more we empower everyone within that organisation, and we start to create a wider skill base that we can draw on. Instead of having one CEO that, if they resign, can pretty much take a significant amount of that energy with them, we collate all of that knowledge, if you like, from what's been generated from everyone in the organisation. So no one person holds the magic key to the organisation's success. And that's quite a nice risk strategy in some ways, isn't it? No one person can hold the company to ransom. The whole point of obviously looking towards decentralisation was to increase productivity. And one thing I will talk a little bit about is this idea that there is no doubt about it that the centralisation process will drive cost efficiency, but will it create overall efficiency in terms of what is being demanded? So let's talk about cost efficiency versus organisation effectiveness. And it's the effectiveness that actually is longitudinal. That's what will survive. Short-term cost gain is not necessarily going to lead to long-term effectiveness. The last sort of debate, if you like, or definition I'll throw in here is this idea that it's actually technological and economic forces that have removed a lot of this command and control environment. You know, technology has changed the way that we manage organisations. It used to be that you had to have one person in charge at the top, and that information would flow down through a series of command posts, and then people would be allowed to go about and do their daily tasks, because it could take so long for a change in that information to flow through the organisation, and it was too risky that certainly if it was cross-border or even in different parts of the same country, that it could actually create problems in terms of organisational efficiency. But now we have in real-time communication. So it is easy for an individual manager operating a single unit within a separate part of the country to be able to communicate with the managers at other branches so that they can actually start to work as one organisation and continue to operate in that way. But it does come back to this idea that it's really about the scale of that organisation's efficiency that becomes really the important factor. And I'll talk about the factors that we need to consider before we make critical decisions. And there's no doubt about it that the size of the organisation is one of those key factors. But we are driving more of a flexible environment through decentralisation, and one that looks closer at the human being as opposed to the organisation. And that's the interesting point. We talk so much about employee engagement, employee satisfaction. We talk about ensuring that people feel value in the workplace. And then on the other side of it, we create high levels of centralisation. And it's almost the two don't live together. And that's what we really have to be careful of. So let's think about the benefits that have come through, certainly a lot of the readings I have engaged with and the studies that have been performed. I don't want to drag my way through them, but these are the ideas that have come up. Benefit of centralisation, no doubt about cost efficiency. We get the scale, we get the economies of scale. By housing all of that activity in one place, we might take 5 HR managers and reduce it to 4. We might end up in an environment where we can actually create a hub of activity for, say, R&D work for pharmaceutical companies. And it's just inefficient to have lots of separate incubated R&D divisions when we could consolidate that and create a much higher level of intensity. It's also around that specialisation. We can put all our brains in one place. And this sort of gets back to the other point of our IP. The IP that we have in an organisation is better off. It is located in one place, so we can draw on it, almost like a database. And we've got our IT people, they're all working in the same hub, so it doesn't matter what my problem is, the specialty skill is all in that same place. Now, if I had that in-house, that individual might not have that breadth of skill to be able to deal with my specific issue and may get it wrong. They may try and get it right and get it wrong. But asset utilisation of plant, property and equipment, utilisation of individuals, and of course making sure that the key decisions are closest to the key managers. Keeping the information close to those who are responsible for the organisation overall. And whether we like it or not, it will always stop at someone at the top. CDHB is a really good example where all of those individual departments and individual line managers have to report through, but at the end of the day, the CEO for CDHB must meet the budget requirements that have been set. And that's non-negotiable. So irrespective of where people feel they sit within the organisation and what their involvement is, one person will carry that responsibility by virtue of probably their job. And to some extent, the wider public in terms of the perception of what they have done to the community in terms of achieving the goals. It's about simplicity of design. I mean, no doubt you want to create an organisational chart. It's real easy to do it top down. Here's a big box at the top and every little box underneath starts to create an organisation. You throw people into those boxes and you call it a company or an organisation and away you go. It's easy to design that way. It's very hard to do cluster groups and make sure that they're efficient and that they actually communicate well across each other. That takes a little bit more work and therefore sometimes is a barrier. Restricts the compartmentalised. I mean, we talk about silos and there's a great debate. Do we create more silos by having centralisation or less? And there's a lot of argument to say actually silo mentality is created because I'm a business unit manager and I'm solely responsible for my business unit, so I will keep everything to myself. Sometimes we even see ourselves competing against our own managers within the same organisation. I want to look good, so therefore I will not share the information I have about how my organisation or my branch is developing. I'll keep that, that's my work, that's my IP. You have to do your job. I want to have a slice of that bonus. So a centralisation process removes some of that and says, to be honest, we're pushing it all up, further up the chain, and the realities are that you will have to manage within the environment that's set. Take away some of those hard decisions. I mean, some people like centralisation because they don't have to make the big calls. I like the fact that HR is done somewhere else. You know, I can pick up the phone and order a new employee. Could you please organise a PD for this person's role, for this type of role, and could you go to market and find me some appropriate candidates? Thanks, click. I have an employee that I'm struggling with. Could you come over and deal with it? I don't have to be responsible necessarily for that because it's centralised, and that way I don't have to make those hard calls around some of those critical decisions. But there is no doubt about it. I think the worst environment you could ever operate in is to have a highly centralised organisation with managers that can't make decisions. Because then nothing happens. And I won't even start to list the amount of organisations that I think fit into that space. Lots and lots of managers, very centralised in terms of its process, but the people who are paid to make the decisions can't make them. So the organisation just stalls. And it just stalls and it stays there until something dramatic happens to try and create change. And usually that dramatic change is brought about through something that is not necessarily positive. It's usually negative. On the benefit side, hey, it motivates. There is no doubt about it. The literature tells us that we are motivated, and if we are encouraged, then we will produce more. And a decentralised environment gives us some sense of control around our own destiny and some level of understanding about the part we play in the organisation. We're not just a number or a part of that process, we're actually a contributing member of the organisation, and we can see where those boundaries sit. We're allowing many minds to work simultaneously. I mean, it is a shame to have so much intellectual capital out there, but say, to be honest, we don't really need your decisions because we're going to hold those in a central place. We don't really need you to think about the HR components of the business because that will be taken care of HR. Oh, so I can just forget it. Yep, no worries at all. Well, actually, in the short term, that seems really good. In the long term, it's not going to help the organisation to look for more opportunities to be better at what they do. And I think this is the struggle we have. It's the trade-off between allowing people to think and then making sure that the system is well enough structured to utilise that groupthink, if you like, and pass it up so it still has value. Accommodates flexibility and individuality. I mean, once again, we talk about what we're trying to do. We're trying to empower our staff. We want them to feel valued. We want them to feel like they're part of a team. But don't make any decisions because you're not really needed to. So what I've got to say isn't valued. No, it's valued, but we just won't listen because the decision's going to be made by someone else. And I think we're even worse now because our centralisation programs aren't necessarily passing it up to a higher being, someone with greater knowledge than us. We're actually passing it to a department made up of people with similar, if not lower knowledge. But because it's the department that's been set aside for that purpose, they make those decisions. And that frustration builds. And it builds daily, and eventually as an employee you go, you know what? I don't need this. I actually think my decisions are better than what I'm seeing coming from the central process. And that's, you know, once again, it's one of the dangers. If we want good people working for us, we have to allow them to feel empowered to make critical decisions. Otherwise, we just wash them out the door. Promote collegial thinking. Decision making is closer to the market. I mean, there is no doubt about it. You need to be reactive to the market. Why is it that the smaller businesses out there seem to produce better net returns than the bigger companies? We've got listed companies that barely make bank rates in terms of their return on investment. Yet we have private companies doing double-digit growth with double-digit return on investment. Why is it? Oh, less overhead. Well, I think you've answered the question. If less overhead ends up in higher net gain to the community, then the reality is, what is the overhead actually achieving? Oh, it's managing the organisation. Well, it's not. It's managing the cost consumption process, but that's about all it's doing. Well, you need someone to control an organisation of this size. Once it gets big enough, you need to have an organisation controlled at a central point. Otherwise, you've got some level of chaos. Well, if each individual business unit is performing extremely well, why do we then need to start extracting key components to save a little bit of extra dollar? Let them do what they need to do. It's almost like a multitude of small businesses connected through some type of reporting process. Better view of emerging trends. I mean, if you can make critical decisions in real time, then you are going to be able to react to the market that you are serving. If you need to go through process, it will delay the process. And I think, you know, there's not a manager I've ever spoken to who hasn't been frustrated at the speed of which things can happen in any organisation. It's just not fast enough to meet the demands of the market. We're going to lose this opportunity. We're not going to get this across the line. We're losing the client. Our competitors are going to take advantage of our sluggish behaviour. And I think that's a real issue that we need to think about as an economy, but also within our own organisations as to how do we speed things up. And if centralisation is slowing it down, then it is wrong if we're in a market that demands high levels of speed. We might be in a business that doesn't need it. That's fine. But if we are, if we're driven by market needs, then we have to be looking at better ways to meet those needs. It's a recognition of trust. People feel trusted if they're allowed to make critical decisions. People feel happier. I mean, the research in the psychology field will tell you all the same thing. Happy employees are more productive. Does it mean that the reason we're so poorly productive as a nation is that we're relatively unhappy? I don't know. I'm unhappy today because it's bad weather, but tomorrow I'll be fine. You know, I think the problem is that we have businesses that are run by people, and the human condition needs to be consistently reviewed in terms of what creates the most creativeness and the most productivity. And if we don't recognise that, then we end up shutting it down and wondering why we get poor performance. And we blame everything else. Oh, it must be the market conditioning. You know, the market's really tough out there. Our competitors are killing us. You know, our costs are all wrong. We've got our cost structure wrong. We're going to have to do some massive rationalisation on costs. Have you had a look at your people lately? Walk out to the shop floor and have a chat to these people that are producing the goods and services that are generating the growth. Are they happy? Are they feeling engaged? Now, I'm not saying every single person should be rocking into work with a big smile on their face. There is a significant number of people out there who work to pay the bills, but it doesn't mean they have to do it miserably. They can still do it with a smile on the face because they will be more engaged, and you'd be surprised how much information you can get from every single employee in an organisation if you just ask. But don't ask if you're not going to do anything with that information, because then they just shut down and disengage. It's almost worse, isn't it? Don't ask for my opinion and then choose to ignore it, or give me no feedback on why you chose to ignore it. Just don't ask me. It's easier that way, and I won't be disappointed. Rapid response to change and conditions. I mean, it goes without saying. We've got to be quicker out there. We've got to be doing things better, and we've got to communicate that through the organisation. A study I did some time ago, actually, a couple of years, and I haven't quite finished it, but went out and interviewed or through a survey system, and then a couple of follow-up semi-structured interviews around companies in New Zealand that have a centralised and decentralised structure. And these are just some of the feedback. I pulled out a couple. And it's quite interesting. Once again, 50-50 debate. There's no conclusion. But centralised. So if we statements against centralisation, procurement, but I can get it cheaper myself. I mean, you hear that all the time. If I go down to Harvey Norman, I can get a computer much cheaper than the university can buy it. Much cheaper. Why is that? Does it mean our procurement manager is not doing his job? Definitely not. It's just at the time I go to buy it, it's probably on sale. Yet the university can't operate waiting for the sales to come through Harvey Norman. And then everyone ends up with different types of assets, and then they have to try and manage those assets on a different scale. HR, they don't understand what we need in our market. Now, this is really common where you've got HR centres offshore. Australians don't understand New Zealanders, not when it comes to HR. Their HR laws are so different. And then once you get to the US, you can fire someone just by looking at them in the US. They don't even get paid holidays outside the statutory holidays. So how do they understand what we need as a business operating in Christchurch, where we don't have 1,000 employees on the shop floor, we have 10. And so there's that level of frustration. The information we get is either not relevant to our branch or it's out of date, finance. I need the problem fixed now. By the time it gets fixed, it'll be too late. I mean, that's sort of my logic around IT. I want the thing fixed now because I'm having problems with it now, and I can't do my job until it's fixed. I don't want to have to log it and wait. Usually I'll find an alternative, and maybe that's the answer. Marketing, one size doesn't fit all. General, I feel that my input is not valued. You know, I'm just another number. I'm just another part of this machine called an organisation, and I don't feel any value towards it, so therefore I feel no obligation towards it. And as soon as you remove that, it's almost just clipping the ticket. Decentralisation, I'm not sure. I'm sure we could be getting a price is better if we consolidate. I mean, that's the whole point of it. Move to a centralised procurement system. With so many changes, I'm much better off that it's all being dealt with in one place. And I think we're seeing a lot of that at the moment, where HR has become such a specialty area, such a danger area for companies around health and safety, that we need to look at centralisation. Marketing, once again, why don't we develop some sort of integrated plan that encapsulates the whole organisation? And we really need to, just for someone to make a call on this issue. Some people just don't like to make decisions. There is actually a significant number of the population that just don't like to make decisions and would prefer someone else makes it. So, Peter Drucker, who's done a lot of work obviously in management field and has spent a lot of time looking at the whole debate around centralisation and decentralisation, has sort of talked about these ideas of things that just don't exist. And I won't go through the list, but it's pretty much that whole idea that the business, there is only one way to do things, and that way is fixed, and there will be fixed from this point on. There is no doubt about it, we have not gone back to that type of environment. It has, and nor probably will we ever go back to what's called a pure centralised process. The issue here is really about what do we need to understand? I mean, is centralisation needed for legislative purposes? Financial reporting has to be done centrally because we have external financial requirements. It's best to be done at a central level. It's mandatory. So therefore, yes. Does it have significant value? Now, there was a really interesting study done in the US, and it encapsulates a whole lot of organisations that have been through centralisation processes and decentralisation processes. And when I say centralised, they've centralised core services as a way to reduce cost. And as we can see straight away, this is a collection of all of those researchers so that the scales don't mean much. But you can see in the short term we get a spike increase in cost. That's the cost of centralisation, if you like. You've got things like you have to pay out redundancies. You have to shut branches down, which sometimes can actually create high levels of cost for payout for leases, etc. But in the relatively short term, the cost structure comes down quite dramatically. They then overlaid the revenue over time. And what we did see, within 3 to 4 years, the company or the organisation is worse off. And you think about it. We see this all the time. I'm a great believer. You can reduce cost and maintain profitability in any organisation for a 12 to 24 month period. Human beings will just adjust. I'm taking one out of every 5 of you guys, but you still expect to do the same amount of work. You'll do it for about 12 months, maybe even 24 if you're really stupid. And then eventually you'll go, you know what? I don't need this. I'm going elsewhere. So the staff rate starts to drop down. And then what has also been happening is customer service levels decrease as a result of being relatively overworked. And then as the customer service rate starts to drop, so does the performance, customer rates drop off, and what do you know, within 4 years, revenues have dropped significantly, and the net gain is less than had they done nothing. And it is amazing. You do see this, and this is also following the trend of where centralisation goes in those waves, and then suddenly we decentralise, and then we centralise, and we decentralise, and we recentralise, and you see, communication companies are always doing it. We're rationalising, we're shutting down, we're doing this, and then within a very short space of time, usually 3 years, they're reversing it because they've realised that it's cost them more in the long run. And I think that's really important, and there's our risks. The risks that we create through centralising process. And this is where we link in innovation. And I don't think it's going to be a hard step for you guys, because the realities are that innovation is not just the production of goods and services or new products, but innovation is creating anything that improves productivity or efficiency. And you've got companies out there that are extremely innovative, not in what they produce. We're not talking the rocket labs here, we're talking a company like Christchurch International Airport, who have engaged in every member of their staff to come up with new ideas on how to improve the organisation. And as a result of that, they've become extremely innovative in how they do their job and how they produce services to the organisation. So, and those who benefit from it. So innovation is not just about making new things, but it's about creating something that is going to increase efficiency and increase productivity and be net benefit gain to society as a whole. And why do we do it? Because innovation creates change, change creates quite often improvement, and improvement will create a more productive economy. A lot of our productivity in the last 20 years has come out of new things that didn't exist. So therefore we need to be consistently looking for that next new thing. Otherwise our economy will stall out. This is a really good example. You know, we're not talking about innovation as to increase a product, its usability, but we're talking about complete change. You know, Apple is such a great example of how we took a cellular phone that did one-way or two-way communication and we created a personalised computer that does everything in real time, anywhere, anytime. And that sudden change and shift has created a complete change in how businesses work. You know, so technological changes will also have a huge impact on the spin-off effect on those companies. So if we think about the R&D, it's split in two areas. You've got innovation that's what we call pure R&D, you know, creation of new things, and a lot of that is around R&D should be very focused on the areas that we're actually trying to achieve the output. So pharmaceutical companies are very good at this. They will look at creating hubs, if you like, centralised hubs of R&D, and they'll work on 10 projects at a time until one of them or two of them look successful, and then they might push the others to one side. And they can do that because they have these massive R&D workshops. They've centralised their costs, they've centralised their intelligence, and they're getting efficiencies from that. But of course, we also need to think about that maybe multi-location R&D, and that's actually what happens, I think, in most small businesses if they were part of a bigger group. They're a small cluster of a business that is daily thinking about ways to do it better. How can we improve on this? How can we make this work better for the client and for the organisation that we're serving? And so therefore the innovation creates right from day one, every day we're at work. And then we cluster them together, and we've seen this with takeovers where organisations have gone through and purchased lots of individually owned organisations, and then they put them in their group and say, we're going to get great cost efficiency now, because what we've done is we've taken out your HR and we've taken out your IT, and we've created, you know, this great structure where finance is controlled by us and all the components that are needed for central management. Then all of a sudden the branch profitability slowly starts to drop. And they go, how did that happen? These were 20% profitable branches that we acquired, and now they're lucky to be doing 15% before we take our contribution margin. And they fail to recognise the one most important factor is they're removing the ability for each individual branch to be creative and to be innovative, and therefore produce better returns longitudinally. The idea being is that multi-located R&D is best for those types of technologies that are simply reproducing something that already exists as opposed to something that's completely new to market. If it's brand new to market, then it probably does need to be centralised to some extent. But if we look about that entrepreneurship, which is leading into, say, innovation at the more global scale or the general scale, then what we're really talking about is decentralisation will support entrepreneurship, which will support innovation. And it's entrepreneurship that's the link. You cannot create innovation without entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurial people are not taught entrepreneurship. They are entrepreneurial by nature. And if you take an entrepreneur or you take an entrepreneurial type person and you put them in a highly structured environment, they will stop being entrepreneurial. It's a proven fact. Not only that, they will probably leave. And so you'll get left with an organisation full of non-entrepreneurial people who won't be innovative. And you then wonder why you cannot produce high levels of productivity. There is a whole range of what they call this healthy ecosystem for entrepreneurs. And I think a lot of it just goes without saying. Limited bureaucracy. Entrepreneurs hate bureaucracy. It slows things down. Anything that slows down their ability to move forward is definitely something they don't want to see. Failure, it must be tolerated. Now, I don't care which organisation you work at now, very few will accept failure. Yet those who do still allow it are seeing better gains in terms of their net results. And there's been a couple of companies recently in Christchurch I won't mention who have allowed their managers to make some risky moves with different types of R&D projects on the premise that it will fail. And that was the basic guideline. Go out there and find me things, and if it fails, don't worry about it. I'm okay with that. I'm expecting it. And the net result have been, certainly for one of those organisations, is a massive increase in new to market innovations as a result of allowing their managers to not feel that they're going to be in trouble for failing. But then on the other side of it, we have so many organisations where if you do succeed, there is almost no gain. There is no recognition of that success. So we end up in that no tolerance for failure, but even if you do succeed, we really aren't going to do anything special about it. And I suppose when you think about New Zealand, we are a relatively small economy. We are the size of Melbourne. We are dominated by 95% of our businesses have less than 20 employees. We are regionally challenged to the rest of the globe. So we have to be doing things differently. We have to be doing it better because our next dollar is not going to flow in from the significant volume of people that exist in the country. We rely heavily on our exports. And so therefore we need to be looking for those successful niche spaces to be able to achieve. And that's not going to happen if we're selling the same goods and services in the same way that everyone else is selling them. We need to be more innovative. And we have some great innovators. I mean, you know, Paul Callaghan, I mean, he was instrumental in coming up with the MRI machine. We split the atom, yet we've chosen not to use it for anything purposeful, i.e. Other than, well, sorry, not quite right. We're using it for medicine, but apart from that, we're certainly not using it for energy, and that's a choice we've decided, but we were instrumental in that process. And, you know, New Zealand is an innovative country, and that's what concerns me. We have high levels of individualised innovation, and then they struggle to get capital to actually make them operating into big businesses and tend to then have to go offshore, who then gobble them up and turn them into mega companies. But our productivity doesn't improve as a result of that. This is where we sit. I think we've got this idea of cost efficiency and management control, which is important, but then we also have to balance in these other factors around the outside. What is it going to do to the environment that we operate in? What's it going to do in terms of our entrepreneurial behaviour? Where's our sense of control as individuals? Are we reactive enough to our market? Do we feel belonging to the organisation? Are we going to be productive? Is there job satisfaction? And so when we're making critical decisions about any centralisation process, we need to factor this into it as well. Otherwise, we could be quite easily led into a cost-based approach to centralisation. And I suppose this comes back to the conclusion. Yes, we've been looking at this decentralisation process for 40 years. Yes, it's a good thing in terms of where we are seeing the positive outcomes, but the debate still comes down to efficiency versus effectiveness. Are we really going to be longitudinally effective by going through a short-term gain of efficiency? And the economic factors that will influence that urgency, unfortunately, when we're right up against it from a cost perspective, as what we saw in certainly the mid-2000s, late 2000s, a lot of organisations went through major cost restructuring because their profits were drying up very quickly, and they felt the only way to do it was to slash expense. And so centralisation was a big part of that process. Unfortunately now we're having to start to unwind some of that, and it's getting expensive because we're having to decouple the process that took place. Innovation drives entrepreneurship, or is driven from entrepreneurship, but we need to create the ecosystem to actually help it develop. There's no perfect world, we have to create the balance, and we need to ensure that there is that balance, or that balance is dynamic. The one point I will make to finalise tonight: organisations don't necessarily have to be innovative. Some organisations, we hope they're not. We just want them to do what is needed to be done. And so therefore, the organisational structure is developed around the organisational strategy. The strategy drives the structure. And the strategy should be, am I market-centric, am I client-centric, or am I service-centric for a particular purpose? I must produce this purpose for society. So therefore that should drive the type of organisational structure we're going to have. What we also have to make sure we do is that as individuals we have to work out what type of environment we like to work in. Because if you put someone who works best in a decentralised, highly engaging, creative environment into a very centralised environment, they will not stay. And so we have this almost conflict between companies that want to be one thing, or organisations that want to be one thing through strategy, but then the organisational structure is the complete opposite of that. And so they're destined to fail. Yet they'll employ based on their strategy, and then those people come in and go, you know what, this is not the organisational structure I want to work within, and they'll leave. And what we end up with is a moderation of staff-based, purely linked back to the structure that's been established. I think it's a really important concept. Companies need to ask themselves that question, or organisations need to ask themselves the question, what kind of organisation are we? So therefore, what structure do we need? And individuals in society need to say, what structure do I prefer to work in? You've got a lot of people out there who prefer highly structured organisations, and they don't mind that environment. They feel safe in that environment even. I know every day when I turn up, I'm not going to be challenged to make critical decisions, and therefore I just have to do my job, and I'm comfortable with that. I don't want to make big decisions. I certainly don't want to be innovative, because I'm not. I'm certainly not creative. Don't get me to think about drawing pictures on pages or whiteboarding stuff. I just can't do it. Perfect for that type of environment. But when you mix those two types of people, you get a very interesting combination. And levels of frustration I think we see on a day-to-day. So anyway, that's it.